First off, Chris, what is a better way to go? Larger tower speakers or smaller bookshelf speakers?
That is a great question. My name is Chris Trojnar. I represent the Harman Luxury Audio Group, which includes the brands Revel, JBL Synthesis, Arcam, and Mark Levinson. So we carry a variety of different speaker products, and for a variety of different reasons. So the first answer to that question is you have to ask yourself, I think, a series of questions. Is what is the purpose of these speakers? Is it for music? Is it for stereo only? Do I want to do multi-channel and surround sound? What is the aesthetic of the speaker? Are these speakers going to be in the room, in the wall? So there's a lot of questions that you have to ask yourself first. But I would say this generally: buy the biggest, best speakers that you can afford. So. And everything that follows with that, right? If there's a center channel, subwoofers. You can't go wrong getting a full range speaker. If you're adding a subwoofer to the system, that's just gonna help with the low end. So even in a stereo system, it can be advantageous to have subwoofers in the system. Now, there's a lot of questions that play into this, as well as aesthetics. So if you want the speakers hidden, there are some great in-wall options that sound fantastic as well. If you don't have the room for the tower speakers, bookshelf speakers are a great option. But as a rule of thumb, buy the best speakers, biggest, best speakers that you can.
All right, even if it results in a divorce?
Especially.
Fair enough. All right, Chris, follow-up question. Does price correlate to performance? If so, in what ways?
It does, and I'm sure my colleagues here on the stage would all agree that as you step up into series of performance levels, you will get better performance. We put better materials, we put better engineering, we put better aesthetics into our more expensive products. So as you step up into a product, it should absolutely always sound better.
Okay. Ben, does rapping your knuckles on a speaker cabinet tell you anything about how well it is made? And rapping like tapping, not like...
Oh, okay. I was wondering if there was going to be like a language barrier going on.
Right, yeah, I just want to clarify.
As some of you may have picked up on my exotic accent.
Yes.
So my name is Ben Hagens. I'm the product training manager and product manager for subwoofers for KEF Audio. So rapping knuckles on a speaker, it's certainly a couple of levels up from kicking the tires in the car you're about to buy, right? So in a lot of ways, a speaker begins and ends with its cabinet. I mean, driver's obviously extremely important, but the cabinet is just this environment for it to kind of, this platform for it to work from. And rapping knuckles on a speaker will tell you if it's a nice rigid cabinet. That's about as far as it honestly goes, because it won't tell you about things like port losses, very little about the bracing, how the cabinet will actually react when the driver is working within it. But it does give you a good indicator, because if the cabinet isn't, if the level of care isn't put into the cabinet in terms of rigidity, you can probably surmise that maybe there's other parts of the loudspeaker that may not be brought up to the level that it needs to be. So those companies that are really serious about what they're doing, they're going to be serious about every single part of the design. Now, whether the knuckle wrap test correlates to anything, really you need to start going into an accelerometer like John Atkinson at Stereophile uses in his measurements, or laser vibrometry, to kind of see how the cabinet actually reacts when the driver's working in wide bandwidth. You're basically putting it through a battery of tests. But then it's a case of, is that actually audible? If you've got a resonance on the back panel, it's like putting a port on the back. Are you going to hear necessarily any turbulence from a port on the back? Are you necessarily going to hear any resonance from that back panel? Because it's away from you, it's far from the wall. So it's a nice beginning indicator, but definitely not something to make a final purchase off of.
Okay, that's reasonable. And just for what it's worth, if any of you, as our panelists are discussing their answers, if you have any further questions, just store that in your mind and make sure you ask them up here later. Will, do technical measurements correlate to how a speaker sounds with your ears? Bated breath, here I wait.
Loaded question. So I think it's first important to note that not all human beings hear the same. There is a great deal of variance from person to person, and even amongst the same person, there's a great deal of variance depending on SPL levels. Right? So a couple of gentlemen by the name of Fletcher and Munson did some excellent experiments that I think we all benefit from on this side of things. So at a given point to a given person, if we were to eliminate some of the variables and say, okay, will better technical measurements comparing one speaker that I'm personally listening to another speaker that has better technical measurements, will I perceive one as being better or worse? And the answer to that, of course, is yes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to prefer the speaker with better technical measurements, right? Hearing is fairly subjective. Even when we plot the linearity of hearing itself, that itself can change over time and change according to distance and volume level. So there's a lot of variables to take into effect. What we believe in our general philosophy is the science can take you so far, and you should absolutely use the science where it is beneficial, where it is useful, making sure that you do things like eliminate spurious vibration, cabinet resonances, interactions, negative interactions between the drivers. That's all very important, and we have great scientific tools to be able to enable that. But when it comes down to it, no matter what my measurement tools say, if the speaker doesn't sound good, it doesn't sound good. Right? We don't make speakers for computers. We don't make speakers for anechoic chambers. We make speakers for human beings in real life living situations. And all of the testing that we do, though obviously we need to make sure that we get to a certain scientific level. Our specifications need to approach what is expected for the price category or whatever it may be. At the end of the day, it's how the speaker sounds that truly matters. And for us, the ultimate litmus test is what is the physiological reaction it has on a human being when a human being listens to it. I find that to be a much more accurate measurement of how good a speaker sounds than anything a CAD or a computer and oscilloscope can tell me.
Yeah, I would like to add to that the fact that we do rigorous testing when looking at a loudspeaker. There's all of the equipment that you talked about, but the other side of that is before a loudspeaker is launched to the public, we do extensive listening. So it's that combination of listening and measuring that makes a great product.
Absolutely.
Anybody else?
Yes, I can only echo. It's the same thing we do with KEF. We have a listening panel, and it's the same listening panel through every single one of our products. Not only to make sure that things are sounding good, but also to make sure that we have that consistency in the KEF sound throughout all the ranges. Listening is the final arbiter, really.
I think that holds true for all of us as manufacturers. I mean, you have whether it's a KEF sound or a Bauer sound or a Sonus fiber sound. I mean, we are trying to make sure that our speakers throughout the range are similar. So if you get a Bauer speaker, whether it's $500 or $50,000, there is a similar sonic characteristic to that. So,
and as that translates to the customers, our customers, Audiovice's customers, again, it's what you like, what makes you happy when you listen to music or listen to a movie. And I'd like to thank Audiovice for bringing these great manufacturers all together, giving you an opportunity to go out and listen to all this stuff. Some of the stuff I've never even heard. So thanks, Audiovice. And thank you.
Okay, Kevin, how can you tell if a speaker will work well in your room without actually testing it?
Well, I think the brutally honest answer is if you just take that question as it is, you can't. The good news is that when you go into it, and we're at Audiovice Live, you go into an Audiovice store, and if you listen to a pair of speakers, regardless of the brand it is, and you really like the way they sound in that store, they're probably going to sound pretty damn good in your home as well. Now, of course, there's factors that you need to take into account. How big is your room? What materials are in that room. I mean, I've had many situations, we all have, where customers will call us and they'll say, hey, is this speaker going to sound good with this product? And the answer is, well, we know that these two pair really well together, but we're not at your house. We don't know exactly what your situation is, so we can't tell you that. But for the most part, I think that if you go listen to a pair of speakers that you find very, very satisfying, and I think it was you pointed out, I mean, to the point is I can tell you all day long that my particular speaker or this particular speaker sounds great, but everyone's made the point, to me, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to sound, the same to you, because we all hear differently. But I do feel like, when you take your time, you walk into a store like Audio Advice, you share with with their sales support and their sales staff what you're looking for, what your needs are. Again, are you doing music? Are you doing home theater? Is this a combination system? Yeah, you can get pretty darn close. And I will say, I think, Chris, you pointed out, buy the biggest, best speaker you can, and I would agree with that. I'll share a story with you. It happens to be a Bowers and Wilkins story. We had a customer call us, and he wanted a pair of the 801s. That's all, he just wanted them. And when he described his room to us, I'm like, that's too big of a speaker for the room. But he wouldn't have it. So he bought the speaker, then he called back, and frankly speaking, he was disappointed. And then, it's like, you never want to say, I told you so. But, so, traded him out, he got a pair of 802s, and it was perfect for the room. So in that situation, without actually listening to it in his room and testing it, it just didn't work. But I think the advice that I'd give everybody is, we all hear differently. You have different aesthetic tastes, but if it sounds good to you at the location, we can probably make it sound good to you in your listening position at home as well. So.
Yeah, I would add, you're dealing with a lot of variables there. And if you're in the privileged position to actually have access to a stereo shop that's ideally near you, right? Actually build a relationship with the dealer. Then you've got the advantage of someone who's tried many, many, many different combinations of these different products in different places, in their store, in other people's homes, and they're going to have a much better general idea about what to mix and match, what will work in a given space, and be able to guide you along that process. They'll also be the best person to determine if something's not working. Right? I've seen people get wrapped around the axle driving themselves crazy, and there was one little thing wrong with their system that could have been easily fixed. And they wind up replacing this and changing that and doing everything else to the system when all they needed was a little bit of good advice. Right? That is priceless. If you can build a relationship with a local dealer, do it. I promise you it will save you time and money in the long run.
Yeah, there's untold experience in dealers, and the guys at Audio Advice have decades of experience, so use them. That's what they're there for.
Yeah, and if you're traveling from out of town and you're not near Audio Advice, go to your local dealer that's in your town as well. And we were talking about this yesterday. I think Scott brought it up with their new their configurator, and I think it was more specifically designed for home theater. But that gives you a really, really good idea where you can put a home theater together. They've done all the heavy lifting for you, and so you probably can get a pair of speakers or a 5 or a 7.1 setup from them or from your local dealer, knowing that all the pre-work was done and it is going to sound good in your room because you're going to follow, the tool that they set out for you. So.
Absolutely, and that is one case where specifications do come into case, right? As an end user, you shouldn't necessarily have to even think about it, but someone who's designing a theater for you, they need to know the SPLs, what the power handling is, what the actual sensitivity is of the speakers, to be able to make sure that we get reference levels from all the different channels at the listening position. Those things become important, but honestly, it's not something that we expect our end users to have to deal with. This is why we go through such amazing efforts to make sure all of our dealers are trained in how to do these things so that you don't have to worry about it.
And that's a great point. I'd like to add to that, if you have the opportunity to listen, whether it's in a store or in a location like this, I spent 18 years on the retail side of the business, and I would always tell my customers, if you like this in the store, you're gonna love it in your home. And I was rarely proved wrong. Now, of course, there are exceptions with some terrible, terrible rooms and terrible circumstances. But if you know that ahead of time, if you have somebody you can rely on, if you can demo the stuff, great. But I will tell you, especially with the Audio Advice team, now working with that team online, we have something we call the internet. And that can be a great tool for you, but it can be very treacherous in making any kind of buying decision without the right guidance. So, the team at Audio Advice, although they have a great retail facility and locations where you can audition the stuff, if you can't, they also have a great online team that can help you and guide you and know all these brands inside and out to help you make the right decision for your room.
Yeah, and just, I guess a cheap plug for myself is, this is where I feel like data can be helpful because not everybody can go out and demo different speakers in different stores all over the country. And not many stores carry maybe a particular speaker that you're interested in. So if you have found that signature channel that you're interested in, you can use the data to help you correlate what it is about that speaker that you like and hopefully find other speakers that measure similarly in that same manner. So, Ben, are some speakers better for home theater applications than they are for music, directivity index, EQability, those different aspects.
How big a can of worms do we have out back?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a big one.
I mean, at the most fundamental level, the job of a loudspeaker is to convert voltage into motion and moving air. The speaker does not know if it's music, if it's a film. So at the absolute fundamental level, there should be no difference between a home theatre speaker and a music speaker. A loudspeaker is a loudspeaker. What I tend to look at more is what is the room it's going into. What is it for a single individual, or am I looking to really fill a room? Listening to music, watching films isn't necessarily something that we do by ourselves all the time, but sometimes it is. So if you're really doing for a single point in the room, then yeah, very kind of narrow dispersion. Loudspeakers are fantastic. You are really dialing into that sweet spot for that person. But for something like home theatre, where you're trying to get great sound to multiple seats, again, rather than kind of focusing into a main listening position, then really shouldn't everybody in the room be getting the best possible performance? So it's, I wouldn't say kind of wide and narrow really kind of works into home theatre or music as a concept. It's really what you're trying to achieve with it is the main point. Can EQ kind of solve things? It's the sprinkle on top, as far as my opinion is. To really get the most out of EQ, you really do need a wide directivity speaker, because what's happening in different parts of the room is going to be vastly different all over. So and EQ is very indiscriminate. It doesn't change what you're doing in the room at every point. It's doing the same thing all the way throughout. So getting the physical right, depending on what we're wanting to do, is absolutely first level. I mean, you cannot EQ out room modes that effectively at all, because say if you're boosting a frequency, what's coming back on that standing wave is just going to be the same, just in the other phase. So it's not really going to fix it. So there's a lot to think about on top of whether it's wide or narrow directivity. EQ is just there just to finish off once you've got everything else done to get as much correct as possible.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think when you're dealing with EQ, and I mean, these days we're talking about room correction, right? So we're not just doing equalization, we're also doing time alignment at the same time, whether it's two channels or a multi-channel system. It is important to do as much as you possibly can in the analog domain. So when you do run that equalization, when you do run that time alignment, the processor does as little as it can to be able to optimize that system. And when we're talking about things like room modes, actually adding energy to a frequency that has a room mode, it'll make it cancel even worse. You're going to get absolutely no difference in amplitude at that particular frequency. So what most of these systems do will actually apply masking, where they start to lower the frequencies on either side, such that you can hear a little bit more of that frequency. But when we're dealing with something like room modes, again, if you're designing a space from scratch, if you have the opportunity to move where different things are going to be, it's amazing what you can do with a subwoofer, whether it's a stereo system or a theater system, for treating the type of cancellation that you normally get from a listening position, right? Because they almost tend to be right in the middle of the room when you get those bass nulls. So being able to completely eradicate, really, those bass nulls is a function of a subwoofer, or ideally two or more subwoofers, even numbers. So there are certain things you can do in the design, and there's certain things that you can do after the fact with equalization, but there's nothing more important than the actual positioning and the actual setup and the actual design of the listening space.
And you don't necessarily need to have, in terms of speaker setup, I mean, not everybody's going to have the opportunity in order to treat the room, especially if they're putting speakers into a room after the fact, say living room, so on and so forth. I mean, I know you're a big proponent of this, Will. Let's say, so am I. We both follow the John Hunter's speaker setup, because the great thing about that, it's not predicated on that the room is perfect.
Absolutely.
It's about getting as much out of the speakers as possible with as little work as possible, really. It's not that intensive a process.
Funny to see that a lot of different speaker manufacturers are kind of honing in on the same general speaker setup practice. First, I should say it is incredibly important and always blows people's minds how much difference you can make in the tonality of a given system simply by moving the speakers a few millimeters in one direction or another. All right, so even in situations where the speakers have to be right there, I could still find a couple of inches of playroom that I can actually optimize that sound. And the other thing is, even in a two-channel system, dealing with those room modes, there's certainly things that you can do in the setup itself. But adding a subwoofer definitely gives you another tool in your belt, not necessarily necessary. And I should definitely say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? If your room is actually fairly flat in terms of frequency response, if it has a good reverberation times, if it sounds good, don't try to treat it, don't try to dampen, don't try to do things to it, don't add things to it that you don't necessarily need, just hoping that it'll get better. If it sounds good, leave the room alone, and people are often surprised how little they need to do to their room to get at that optimal balance of reflection and diffraction and absorption.
So actually, Will, and we discussed this at a separate time, but we talked about, not just buying the speaker, but also buying the experience. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. Yeah, whether we're talking about a theater system, even a multi-channel listening system, certainly a stereo system, what we manufacture, what the folks at Audio Advice sell, it's not the stuff. The stuff is cool, and the stuff is important, and the way that we make it obviously has to do with it. That's not what you buy as a consumer. You buy the ability to have a place to sit in your home where you can press a button and be teleported to somewhere else in space and time. Perhaps into someone's imagination, a place that doesn't even exist. Right? And I feel like we live in a society where everybody is trying to figure out ways to be in the moment. Right? We spend all this money on yoga, meditation, read books, do self-help stuff, to try to figure out how to relieve ourselves from the anxiety of thinking about the future or the pain of thinking about the past and just be here in the moment, the Zen state, right? I think a good audio system, one that's really, really capable of suspending disbelief, of making you feel like you're somewhere else or that there's someone in the room with you, it's a shortcut to a Zen state. It's hitting a button and within 30 seconds you get the same exact mental condition as hours and hours of meditation, right? Having that, it makes you a better person. It makes you more peaceful. It makes you more kind. It makes you more empathetic, right? So it is the experience that we're buying. And people always ask me, one of the most common questions I get, well, how much should I spend on my speakers? There's no way for me to answer that, right? So, okay, maybe there's rules of thumb that I can apply. Let me think about it. And really gave it a lot of thought. And in my opinion, you should spend as much on your speaker system, at least, as you've spent on your motor vehicle. Because when you think about these two transport mechanisms, one of them is clearly more powerful, one of them is clearly more efficient, one of them is clearly capable of going more places. So why would you sink a bunch of money into a car when you could have a teleport?
What if you have a really cheap car?
Adding to Will's point, talking about the aspect that we are grateful to be here around people and experiencing people and interacting with people again. But I think, the last few years has taught us that life is short. It's important to have a sense of, family, however that's defined to you. And what we found over the last couple of years, our business is doing fantastic because people are realizing that staying home and having that experience, having that connection with your family and your friends, it's something we've learned, and it's something that I am grateful is not going away. I think it's just getting stronger. And what better way to enjoy time together than with music and with movies and experiencing that, or a sporting event with friends and family. And the way to do it is have a great audio system.
Yeah, I think all of us on stage can probably agree we've got the worst jobs in the world.
Yeah, they're terrible. Yes.
Yeah, because we get to bring this. Okay, I'm speaking for you guys a little bit here, but I'm sure we've all come into this because we love what music and what film does. We are hobbyists first and foremost into this, and we're able to kind of share what we've experienced and bring that experience into things. Because all of this, it's not about this, it's all about that, right? And people buy from people, and there's no other industry where that's truer than the audio industry. So come in and see us all, in every room, have chats, have talks, because they say this isn't manufacturers and customers, this is music, film guys and girls all getting together and having a good chat, having a hell of a lot of fun.
Absolutely right.
Well, and Ben, to add to that point, what's happened even over the last couple of years as we're talking about equalization and room correction, these things have gotten better and more affordable. The experiences that I can show you today in my room and these guys can show you in their rooms, these are experiences that we can provide at price points that even 5 years ago were, maybe unobtainable for a lot of people, for most people, but now have become so affordable and so good that I feel that just about anybody could afford to have that type of musical or theater experience, and technology has really helped with that.
I think to that point, when you think about this, we're obviously talking about in the stuff that you guys and gals are seeing here at this show. There's, I think it was yesterday, we talked about a $350,000 speaker. But the point of entry, when you think about what has happened over the last couple of years and the fact that movie studios, and we'll flip over to home theater here for a second, there's obviously still musical aspects and sound from soundtracks and stuff. You switch over to home theater, just the fact that these movie studios have been streaming content, brand new movies into the home, and the customer's watching that on their television, it doesn't sound good, and they know that it can sound better, and even the advancements in adding a sound bar, and then a customer says, that was a pretty terrific experience, and then they experience a receiver with a pair of left and right speakers, and then they go from that to a left, center, right, add a sub, surrounds, and all of a sudden it's like as terrible as what is the last couple of years has been, Chris, you said this, for our industry, it almost feel guilty, it's been crazy. Again, the people spending time at home and with their families and watching movies, and it's brought so much energy to our industry, and I think Ben, you were saying this. I feel blessed every single day. Yes, there's definitely hard days at work because we all work for manufacturers and companies, and we all have a boss to report to, and we have sales numbers to hit. But we've turned our hobbies into careers, and I talked to so many friends and family over the last 30 years, like, I got to get up and go to work tomorrow. I'm like, I got to get up and go to work tomorrow. It's awesome, right? So. But again, this whole experience that we have, it starts off with, the more content that we get, the more we can take that content and turn it into something super, super special. I sat on a panel, what did we say yesterday? The iPod is 20 years old now, or 30? Yeah. I remember sitting on a panel in Toronto, Canada, and it was about the future of audio, and it was about audio is dead, music on an iPod is, it was one of the greatest things that ever happened, because again, it got people listening to music, and then they started saying, well, it can sound better. So, and we've seen that over the last 20 years, and these last 2 years or 3 years have just been an incredible acceleration. So it's just great to be here. Yeah. Great to have you guys here.
Yeah, music and film, means 7.5 billion different things to 7.5 billion different people, right? And every single one of them deserves great sound and great picture coming to it as well. And we're now at a stage where anybody can find exactly what they're looking for within their means with the advances that have happened over the years, over the recent years. Across all the companies represented on this stage, everybody out there, there has never been a better time for music in general, actually, and for the audio industry. So keep exploring.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's not really a bad speaker in the bunch when you look at these manufacturers that are represented by audio. And it's honestly getting more and more difficult to find bad speaker, quote unquote, objectively bad speaker at all anymore. So it's interesting in that it gives us as manufacturers the opportunity to really express ourselves and what our true philosophy is as something different from the foundation that I think we've all helped to create and support. right? So if I'm going to spend a given amount on a given pair of speakers, or a given amount on any pair of speakers, there are certain things that I can come to expect. I know that they're going to have a certain amount of resolution. I know they're going to have a certain amount of dynamic range. I know that they're going to be easy to drive. I know that they're going to be efficient, right? There's all these things that we've all kind of, as the entire industry raises and technology moves forward, we all increase the quality of our products. So it's great in that we get to really see what is honestly the biggest difference amongst any of these different categories of manufacturing, certainly speakers, is the people. All right, we all have access to the same tools, we all have access to the same science. It's really the drive of the engineers and the designers and figuring out what is the ultimate goal of this particular product or this particular family relative to how people are going to use it. So we actually get a better chance to express ourselves as human beings through our product because all of us have gotten so much better over the years. And I would also say, in reference to the flu, that I'm a silver linings guy, and I'm always looking for that. And there is definitely some need to find some silver linings throughout all of that. But if there is a silver lining, I think it's the appreciation of our time together, the appreciation of your time spent in your home. And I don't see that something that we're going to vaccinate away. And I think that's a new realization, a new understanding that we're all going to take with us. And it does make it more important to have that space, again, that space, that teleporter, that instant tranquility that you can share with your family. So you can all be entertained, be in that space together, share that togetherness in a state of mind that keeps you all in the moment, not messing around on your phone or thinking about we got to do at work tomorrow. Everybody's there, sharing the same time, the same space, the same experience. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And Ben, back to your point, you brought up something about the content that's available to us for streaming services. You know, our friends at Qobuz, for $20 a month, you have access to high resolution audio, thousands, if not millions and millions of songs, and all for $20 a month. Are you kidding me? I grew up in this industry. I started in the early 90s, and I would save every paycheck to go out, and I would buy, a stack of CDs, and
It's $20
the
each.
investment in the content that you had to put into it. It was, at the time, hundreds and if not thousands of dollars a year that I had to invest in buying that content. And then, this is my collection, right? It's limited, and now it's infinite. So I think having that access to the content and that high quality content is really just, it changes the game, and I wish everybody could understand the experience of having better quality equipment and gear to listen to that on.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're going to do questions shortly after, so if you don't mind holding that for a second. Okay. For what it's worth, Will, you said a couple things. You mentioned, having the ability to listen to music as a family together, also maybe, I don't know if I want to say replacing yoga, but the meditation aspect. So you've saved families and you've saved a lot of money on therapist bills. We can just use that money to buy stereos, right?
Yes, nobody told me.
Just
when
go
I
to your
got into
wives
this
or your
industry.
significant others and say, listen, we don't need to spend money on all these other things. We're just going to buy a new stereo. This
Nobody
is a
told me.
general question.
No,
Right?
but just to finish up, nobody told me when I got into this industry that I would have to become a marriage counselor and
Yes.
a therapist. I think I've done a pretty good job.
You're doing pretty well, yeah. So one general question is, if I'm deaf, do I need speakers? If I'm not an audiophile, is it worth spending more on higher quality speakers?
My mother is Scottish, and if there is a more frugal people on the planet, I will give you $10. All right. So I lived in Hong Kong for the last 5 years, working for CAF, and the one time my parents came, my parents had no idea what I was doing. All right. So what is this audio thing? They were not really interested. But we've got this beautiful experience showroom in Hong Kong called the CAF Music Gallery, and my parents came over and visited, and it was the end of, they were in China for 3 weeks and they saw me for 3 days. And I sat mum down and started playing her something, and then it kind of twigged. She was listening. We weren't talking tech. I was talking music. Talking experience. And then he kind of twigged. And then she understood. And if she understands, then absolutely anybody out there is going to be understanding. So I don't particularly subscribe to the whole thing that there is audiophiles and non-audiophiles.
Yeah, it's music lovers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just we have music lovers who know, and music lovers who have yet to be introduced to what great sound, the potential is there. And so I think, yes, it's absolutely worth spending more on a better experience, even if you don't really consider yourself as an audiophile.
Yeah, I've been doing this for over 20 years, and I've yet to demonstrate a product or a speaker or a piece of gear to a customer and not be able to show somebody that it sounds better. It doesn't matter if you have hearing damage. As we age, obviously, our hearing diminishes. But what we do is it's emotional. We connect to the music, and we connect to the music through the gear, through the experience of that product. And I'm convinced anybody can hear the difference, and I'm convinced anybody on this stage, anybody at AudioVice could show anybody the difference.
It's always my favorite question when you're talking to a consumer and they're like, well, I can't hear the difference. Yes, you can. Give me 5 minutes. I mean, you absolutely can hear the difference. So you just have to want to. So we talk about, what are your musical tastes? Let me find that magic track, and all of a sudden you're like, well, I've never heard that before. So.
It is. Always looking for my rules of thumb. In this case, I believe if you are capable of recognizing a friend on the telephone, your ears are more than capable of hearing the differences between a better stereo system and what you're currently listening to. Really all it takes. And I have actually sold stereo systems to deaf customers. They enjoy subwoofers.
Okay, so I guess I'll leave this up to you guys. Do y'all want to go ahead and maybe take questions, or is this a question that interests you guys and y'all want to address?
We can dig into this real quick if we got time.
Okay, all right. Will, what is the best way to set up a new pair of speakers in your room?
Speaker setup. All right. So it's important to remember when we're setting up a pair of speakers that we're working with the room, right? It's the relationship between the speakers and the room, nothing else, right? We're going to establish the listening position as a calibration point, but a good setup should sound good from everywhere, and a well-calibrated pair of speakers should make every place in the room sound better, right? Certain rules of thumb, and I think most of these cats would agree, we want generally a 60-degree listening angle. So we want those speakers to be, once they're finalized, in about an equilateral triangle between the two speakers in the listening position. Right? When we're dealing with bass, and for me, bass is 90% of the setup, because if I can deactivate those bass modes and I can actually make the overall low frequency response as flat as possible in the room and get as low as the room can possibly support, everything else seems to stack up and create a perfect pyramid. It's just the foundation that you build up your setup on top of. So our method, this is based highly on the John Hunter Master's method, is first we start with the nearest boundary, which is usually going to be your front wall. Right? The distance between the speakers and your front wall is going to determine the lowest possible frequency you're capable of rendering in the room. Right? So as we're pulling, and again, we do nothing but listen with this. We have literally no measurements, no tools that we use. We do nothing but use our ears. I like to listen to, and it was the Ballad of the Runaway Horse that we always did when I was doing that training at retail. Still use that track today. It's a really, really well-recorded stand-up bass recording. Great thing about a live bass is it has overtones and undertones, and those are the things that we hear interacting with the room. So you get something that you're familiar with, stand-up bass that has a nice wide frequency range, and we're simply pulling the speakers into the room until we hear the lowest possible undertone we can hear in that instrument. All right. Once we've got that, we can basically find symmetry between the two speakers, and then we want to start adjusting the distance of the speakers to each other, all right, across this domain. And of course, we're also adjusting the distance of the speakers to the side walls. So in this case, what we're actually doing is controlling how much of the information coming particularly from the mid-range, but really all the frequencies, particularly the mid and high frequencies, is reflecting off of the wall before it reaches your ears or directly reaching your ears, right? And by calibrating that, we can figure out how wide we want our soundstage to be. All right? We're always looking for accuracy, so it's important to listen to something that you know the general spatial relationships between the instruments and how large the overall soundstage should be. But what we're essentially trying to do is just make it wide enough that it sounds real, right? But so the instruments all have their own focus point. All right? So we can literally just change the distance of the speakers to each other and to the walls at the same time, and just find that point where we get really good solid focus. So the thing that I always listen for is the female vocalist, Jennifer Warnes in this case. What is the size of her mouth listen like, right? Not look like, because we're not looking at it, but what does it listen like? Right? And essentially, when the speakers are not properly set up, whether they're too close to each other or too far apart from each other, you'll get this diffusiveness that'll actually make the sound like it's coming from a mouth this big. And all we're doing is adjusting the speakers to the point where we're trying to get that as concise as possible. This will bring you more focus for every single instrument. It'll allow you to hear more of the air and space that surrounds everything. It just puts everything into focus. At that point, we have a particular step for adjusting the toe. Again, much figuring out the directivity of the different drivers, which, by the way, are different for different drivers, right? Your high frequencies tend to be more beamy, whereas your low frequencies essentially emit in 360 degrees. So what we're doing is we're trying to focus the array, the dispersion of those different drivers, so that they're balanced as they can be at the listening position. Right, when we play with the toe. Toe is one of the things that does differ from speaker to speaker, so you've got to know what the general practices is. Some speakers do like very little toe, almost completely plumb line. Our speakers do enjoy a great deal of toe, depending on the listening position and the overall distance. It really depends. And then the final step, and one that I see a lot of folks miss, and it's so important, is the rake angle. All right, rake angle needs to be perfectly symmetrical. All right, you cannot have the slightest variance between the tilt of one speaker relative to the back wall and tilt of the other speaker. All right, they need to be perfectly symmetrical. Once they are symmetrical, then we can actually tailor to taste how much toe we want both of those speakers to have. But I've gotten into situations where there was a brightness, there was this weird echoiness, there was just a lot of distortion happening in the upper frequencies, and all I needed to do was lock the rake angle in, and the whole system just got quieter, more relaxed, everything was better integrated, the bass got better, everything. So that's a really important step that folks miss. That's it, that's all we do.
Yeah, it's a great setup process that, because as I said, it's not based on the room being perfect.
Right.
Let's say if you've got if you've got like a fireplace as the focal point of the room, and that may not necessarily be have acoustic symmetry at that point. It's a great way, and it's easy to do. And you can always go back a step. It's almost like pyramid in shape. The biggest movements are at the bottom where you're coming off that front wall, and then everything is based upon that. And I mean, you can try it. Go home. You don't need to touch your speakers, but stand at the wall, start talking, and just shuffle off the wall and hear how your voice changes. And you'll hear exactly what you're trying to listen for when you're doing that off the front wall part of the setup. Anybody can hear it. And I've shown it to dealers, and they've never seen that before, and they're like mind blown. It's like, this is so easy.
Yeah, we actually conduct this training in a classroom setting, and there's never been a single class that I've taught where everybody in the room wasn't able to hear that first step of or dropping the anchor, as we call it.
Yeah.
Locking in that first speaker. It's very effective and very easy to do. And again, you can recognize the family members on the phone. You've got ears that are capable of setting up speakers.
Yeah, Ben, I think you said something I think it's really important. It's just, for everybody here who's an enthusiast, what these guys are talking about, it's super fun to do this at your house. I mean, you set up your speakers the way you thought were perfect. They sounded great. I mean, you could be done if you want, that's fine, but go the extra step and move them apart a little bit, move them in a little bit, toe them in, toe them out. I mean, it's super, super cool. It's like, totally different, but I equate it to setting up a turntable. I mean, there's a big process when you go in and you install the whole turntable. It's not something you just bought out of the box and you set it down and you plug it in and you play it. You add the platter, you add this motor, you do all that stuff. The same thing with, there's some real appreciation there. I did this. And then it's the same thing in your home. You created or helped recreate that sound in your home. And you're going to find a few different things. You may find something that sounds better or different. I mean, I remember years ago when we all got into surround sound, and the customer always wanted to turn the surround speakers up really, really loud so they could hear them. and then this, a jet would fly by and they'd turn their head. That's not what the producer intended. It's to involve and envelope you in the soundtrack. But at the end of the day, we leave a customer's home and we'd say, this is the proper way to do it, but that doesn't necessarily mean this is the way you have to do it because you just paid for this system. And so customers would like to have their surrounds up louder and things like that. And again, when you get this stuff at your house, this is your gear. Yes. We can give you all the guidance that you want, but if, we all hear differently, and if there's something that you did that makes it sound better to you, well, then that's the right way to do it. So at the end of the day.
Yep. And fundamentally, I think this question came up in looking at in the last session talking about room, but I think it's worth bringing up again. Most of us have nice systems, but if it's in a family room, there might be something in between your speakers, like a television, a cabinet, a coffee table. It's important to keep in mind as you bring those speakers out into the room to break that plane, to get those speakers past anything that might be in between your speakers. It's a simple, fundamental thing that you can do, but boy, oh boy, it can transform your system like that.
I think we're ready for questions. If anybody would like to stand up, there's a hot mic over here. If you have any questions for our panelists.
I wanted to ask on that subject of basically it's all over kind of sort of all day yesterday. The Q-Boat, how do you pronounce it?
Cobuzz.
Cobuzz, yeah.
Cobuzz, okay. So is there a significant difference between the Cobuzz and say the high res that is now available and streaming on Amazon Music?
Well, nice show. See y'all later. So I'll repeat the question. Basically, it was, is there a difference between Cobuzz and other streaming platforms? I think that's kind of what it boils down to. Okay.
Short answer is yes. Not only do we see different resolutions amongst the different streaming services, you will actually find tracks on a given streaming service that has different resolutions available and different renditions and versions of the mixdown available. And it really gets to a fundamental question about which medium is best, what resolution is best, and we could talk all day about this. I'm sure we have differing opinions somewhere. But what I have found in my personal experience is that what the format that sounds best is the format the track was mixed for. If it was mixed for a pair of iPhone, iBuds, and a car stereo or a cassette player, it's going to sound best on those mediums in those formats, right? If it was mixed for a super high resolution, DSD, digital track, then it's probably going to sound best in that resolution, in that format. That's why I always think it's important when you're building a stereo system to make sure you have the capability of playing every medium that's currently out there, and ideally a path to upgrade when some new medium comes about, right? Which we know will happen. But yeah, when it comes to streaming, we've all got our favorites. I'm a huge fan of David Solomon. I won't hide that. But no, when you talk about Cobuzz, you are talking about a high-resolution streaming service. That's exactly what it is, and it was built from the ground up to satisfy folks with ears. Satisfy folks who enjoy listening to well-recorded and high-resolution music. But as to which format is exactly better, none of them are perfect. Right? And the differences between them may become subjective according to your listening. I personally hear really, really high up into the frequency band, so any type of filtering that happens up there, I'm pretty sensitive to. So I do find more enjoyment from higher resolutions, getting above that Nyquist frequency, especially with complicated information, complicated tracks. Some people don't. Some people don't hear that difference at all. If you come listening to my demo, most of what I'm going to be playing is 16:44:1 CD quality stuff. Not because it's the best format available, but because the track that I want to listen to was mixed for that format. Right? So yeah, we could spend all day answering this question.
I would say this because this is an important element of choosing your streaming service. I prefer Cobuzz. I really like Tidal as well. These are the two high-resolution streaming services, audiophile, if you will, streaming services. But the reason I love Cobuzz so much is the way the content is delivered to me, the way I consume music. Again, there are millions and millions of options out there, but the way it's presented in such an elegant way of discovering new music and the interface and that experience of, oh, hey, this is a playlist. Listen to this playlist. I find so much new music, and this is what it's all about. It's finding
The
new music.
curated playlists
Yes.
are magical
Yeah.
on Qobuz, and the radio mode. Just being able to pop in a song that you know you love from an artist that you really dig, and listen to all this new music that you've never heard before. That more often than not these days is actually really well recorded and worth listening to on a really high-end system from artists that you've never heard of. Because there's more music being made today, right now, in this moment, than the universe has ever known. Right? More good, well-recorded music.
Was your question specific to if you took two tracks, the exact same tracks, and they were both, playing back in, 192.24, and one's on Amazon Music and one is on Qobuz? Were you asking if there's a difference there, or were you just talking about the differences in the streaming formats? I mean, because to these gentlemen's point, you've talked about Qobuz, for example, they're...
Because I'm somebody who's really still very much steeped in vinyl and even CDs, so I'm sort of been playing with some streaming the last few months, and I've been very surprised and impressed because I last listened to it 4 or 5 years ago, still was not impressed. It really is very good at this point, going through the most discriminating systems, and so I was just curious.
Yeah, I would say get yourself a Qobuz account and stop worrying about it.
I hear it's free for
somewhere
90
David's
days.
putting some money into your PayPal account for that comment, which is good. So that's good advice.
That's right, 90 days to check it out.
The cool thing about the streaming services is regardless of which one you choose, the fact of the matter is there is so much music out there that we've never heard before.
Yep.
And it's just a great opportunity. I have not young kids, a 27 and 25-year-old, and they've gotten me into music that I would have never thought I would have listened to. And then once I hear that, then I go on to one of the streaming services and I learn about that group, and then that shows me a different group. It's pretty awesome. It's really awesome.
The rabbit holes are endless and enjoyable.
Oh yeah. There's never been the best time for music is tomorrow, because we've got all the stuff that came all the way before that we continue to have access to through, easy access to in high quality from streaming services like Qobuz, and then we've got all the new stuff that's going to be coming through the next day.
Yeah.
All right, you ready for the next question?
Yeah, I was going to add to that real fast, something that Will touched on. Nobody wants to hear, so that's cool. If you are comparing between different formats, just keep in mind what you're comparing, because in my experience, there may be one album that you just love, and it's mixed and mastered 5 different ways over the last 20 or 30 years it's been out. Like, for example, I love Tears for Fears, unashamedly. I just love them, right? So, yeah, that's right. Songs from the Big Chair, I've got 5 different versions of it because they're all mastered in different ways, completely. And some of them, the left and right stereo channels are flipped and shout, for what it's worth. So keep that in mind and maybe be cognizant of that. If you're going through and you're kind of trying to compare, you may be tricked, quote unquote, into thinking that one format's better, and you're actually just listening to 2 different masters entirely. So just for what it's worth. We got a question. Okay.
Thanks. Thanks, Will, for that amazing explanation on how we can make all of our speakers sound great.
Oh, thank you.
I'm curious, all of you make amazing in-wall speakers. For those of us that are planning to use those, how do we apply the great, advice you gave to making those sound great?
Yeah, so obviously with an in-wall or in-ceiling speaker, there's only going to be so many places you can put it. You might get an opportunity to choose which stud bay. You might get an opportunity, depending on the thinness of the speaker, the width of the speaker, to within that stud bay, move a few inches here, a few inches there. One of the tricks we used to do with my install team when I worked on retail is we would actually take one of our on-wall speakers, and we would actually play with it, do basically the exact same setup method, going through, playing Ballad of the Runaway Horse of Jennifer Warnes, and actually changing the position of the speaker relative to the height and width on the wall to find what we found was going to be the best. And we'd mark it off, and we'd make sure that we put the speakers there. That is one method you can use. But when it comes down to theater systems, because again, we've got these great DSPs, we've got this great equalization. We try to do as much as we can in the analog domain, but much of that is going to be tailored out in the equalization that you apply, the room correction that you apply. So it's still important to me to try to maintain, and if you look at Dolby spec or any other home theater spec, try to maintain that equilateral triangle between you and the main left and the main right listening speaker, whether be that in wall or in ceiling or anything you need to do. For a theater system, ideally you do want the front 3 speakers at the same height, which can become very difficult for some folks, especially if you're dealing with a flat panel TV. Don't necessarily want all of your speakers down low. You can't poke a hole in the screen and put your speaker there. which many of the modern theaters are using perforated screens and the exact same center speaker behind the screen. That's kind of the ideal way to do it. But every system is a symphony of compromises. You got to figure out which ones are going to work subjectively for you and what you're not willing to sacrifice. For me, I think three-dimensional sound staging is very, very important when listening to stereo, but it's something that I'm willing to sacrifice a little bit when I move over to theater. Simply because I know that's going to be augmented with all of these other channels of information, right? So the setup can be a little bit different if I'm really focusing on that. But in general, it's the same. And there are certain companies, a representative of one that may be sitting on the stage right now, that make some really, really gorgeous in-wall and in-ceiling speakers, so you don't have to sacrifice the aesthetic just because it's a square in the wall.
And I would just add to that, you don't have to sacrifice the performance. I touched on this earlier about talking about the technology advances. The architectural in-wall and ceiling category is something that has just exploded over the last 5-10 years. And manufacturers have paid attention to that and put the precision and engineering that we put into our box speakers into our in-wall and in-ceiling technology into those speakers. So don't be afraid of a custom in-wall or in-ceiling system.
Yeah, that's
They
well
sound
said,
some
and
of
I
the
think that
best
goes
sounding
for
systems
everybody.
I've done recently have been architectural. I'm sure y'all would agree.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
There are actually certain advantages to an in-wall speaker with the infinite baffle idea. It can actually be easier to place.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Bruce from Monroe, Georgia, and thank you for putting on this conference. It's been fabulous so far, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it. But this is a technical question and kind of an engineering question about speakers. I've always been totally intrigued by electrostatic speakers. The first pair I ever got was in 1973, and they were magnaplaners, and they were the big, like almost room divider type speakers. And they still actually sound good today. I don't use them, but I have them, and I've used them in certain, where I've had rented homes or something like that. But then when I went in to see these Piega speakers, it was like an epiphany, because I'm looking and listening to these things, and the electrostatics portion of it, they don't move, they're just rather small. You can't see any visible shaking or air, something that you would intuitively think is like moving the air, and yet the sound is so incredible. Can someone explain how do electrostatic speakers actually work? Is it a different kind of a deal compared to conventional speakers with cones and all that stuff?
I'll take it. Someone else wants to? Go ahead. Sure. So in a traditional transducer design, you essentially have a magnet, usually a powerful, neodymium magnet. And essentially what is a temporary electromagnet in a coil of wire. All right? The coil of wire is going to create that electrical force that actually pushes against the magnet or attracts toward the magnet. So every time that signal changes, it's actually changing the polarity of that motor to make it draw toward or push away from that magnet. That's how a traditional transducer works. Tweeters are a little bit different because the motor's around the circumference of the membrane, but pretty much work the same way. Now with a electrostat, you essentially have a stator, and you've got a material, you've got the diaphragm, and that diaphragm is undergoing the same magnetic forces between those two metal screens on either side of it. All right? So it works very, very similarly. One of the advantages, and there are some, of an electrostatic speaker is you're interfacing more air, right? So there's more contact between the membrane and the actual space of air. So when we talk about delicacy and intimacy, that ability to hear those tiny, tiny, minute details, like the lips of the singer coming apart and her tongue moving and things like that, electrostats do that incredibly well. But there's no such thing as a perfect speaker system. Everything we make is going to be a symphony of compromises in one degree or another. And the problem that I have had sonically with electrostatic speakers is there's really no way to make low frequencies with them without completely tearing apart the accuracy of the other frequencies that it's rendering. So in most cases, they're going to be crossed over to a subwoofer, some sort of a subwoofer system. And ideally, because that's really the danger point right there, ideally you're capable of making a crossover system where you don't immediately hear the transition point between where the panel is being activated and where the subwoofer is being activated. And that's not to say that there aren't other problems with dynamic type speakers, with standard type drivers that electrostats don't have, additional crossovers crossovers in the network is something electrostats really don't need because they're capable of doing such a high range or a wide range of mid-range and high frequencies. Right? So there's gives and takes to each of them. We prefer dynamic speakers because we find that they work in more places, but I would never take anything away from an electrostat. And I have found that selling an electrostat customer anything else is very, very difficult to do.
And a word to the wise, never put a toothpick when you're trying to see what's between the two metal films. Don't stick a toothpick in there to see what is between them. It doesn't end well.
And just to clarify, Will answered it spectacularly, but the Magnepan speakers that you currently own are technically electromagnetic speakers that operate a little bit differently than electrostatic speakers.
Okay.
It's often recommended to pull speakers off the wall with speaker placement. Can the same be said for your listening position against the back wall? How important is that? And how do you do, I guess, kind of the same setup for listening position?
Yeah, that's a great question, great point. It's especially true in home theater. In home theater design, you certainly never want to place a couch or a chair against a back wall unless it's absolutely necessary and you need that extra row of seats. The same would hold true for stereo as well. You will get reflections off that back wall that will affect the experience, that listening experience, and you want to get that listening position off of that back wall.
And you also get considerable bass build-up at the edges of the room as well. But also coming back to home theatre on that, if you're doing in-wall home theatre and you're doing surround rears, and if you're sat up right up against that back wall, you're not going to get that sense of surround around to the back of you because the speakers are effectively either side of you, firing forward. So yeah, there's loads of reasons just for the lower guard, come off that back wall. It's one of the best things that you will do for your system if you are doing that now.
On the theater side, if you're right up against the back wall, you just don't get the enveloping experience. Anyways, then all of a sudden, all your content you're hearing is really behind you. So. Okay.
I got a question that's up your alley, I guess, about what to look for in your next upgrade. And my bias has been to look for the best amplifier I can get, the best component I can afford, and put together a system that way. And then when it comes to the speaker, I've always looked for the best passive speaker I can afford. And I wonder if you can comment on the passive versus powered speakers. And if you're looking at a discrete amplifier, then it's designed to amplify to a speaker, and a speaker that's powered has got the amplifier and the speaker, and it's trying to do two things at once. And I assume that since I was a kid, the technology for powered speakers has come a long way. But if what you're looking for, if you can just comment on a passive powered.
Okay, so I'm going to expand your options there by going passive, powered, active. So passive, as we know, amplifier into the crossover, into the drivers. Powered, pretty much exactly the same thing, except the amplifier is now inside the box. Active, so it's not about where the amplifier is, it's where the crossover sits. So, oh, just swallowed something. So, with an active speaker, we are putting the crossover before the amplification. So we now have 2 or 3 legs of reduced bandwidth signal, and then we have to separately amplify those different legs. So I think passive, there will always be people that want to play around with mixing, matching, and system synergy, etc. And that's where passive is fantastic. You can really kind of tune things in for how you want to enjoy the system. Powered, it's a little bit more difficult. Let's say the amplifier is now inside the box, so it's not quite as clear cut. Active, this is where the manufacturers, us, say, you guys with Formation as well, and you guys with Omnia, is it Omnia? Yeah. And we've all got active products, and this is where we've taken the idea of we know what the drivers are capable of, and this is what we feel is required in order to get what we feel is technically or whatever the best out of this product. And there's a lot of things you can do with active that you cannot do with passive. For example, with ourselves, we managed to iron out phase distortion in the crossover because we can do that in the digital realm. There's a lot of DSP involved. I mean, we're able to bring out a lot more sort of stitch together the component parts a little bit more neater in order to kind of push what the technical capabilities just that little bit further. But there is definitely a role to play for all three in the audio industry.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And to your point, what you just said, to be able to push those transducers, you can push them safely because and again, back to the technology of active loudspeakers, what's happened even in the last 5-10 years with DSP and controlling these motors, it's gotten so much better, so much better.
Much harder to blow them up.
Much harder to blow them up. You can still do it.
Yeah, you can. You certainly can.
Yeah, there's a lot of advantages from a manufacturing standpoint to doing active design because you're basically talking about specialization versus standardization. Right? If I'm making an amplifier that has to work with dozens and dozens of different speakers, well, I've really got to open up those criteria by which I'm designing it. Whereas if I'm building an amplifier specifically for one driver in one channel and a speaker that I'm making, I know exactly what it can do and what it's allowed to not do and still be able to implement it perfectly. So it becomes more of an efficient both in the design process and the operation itself, because we're crossing over before we go to amplifiers, we're not amplifying frequencies that we're not using. And so it actually becomes much more efficient. But again, the disadvantage there is you don't get to piecemeal your own system and build it to taste. Right? And that's something that's super important to me. I could never go a full active system.
I love when we hear, though, too, on an active system where it's like, well, you're not an amplifier manufacturer, so that can't be as good as. But to your point right there, we knew exactly how to design that. So.
All right, so I think that's it.